There is perhaps no story more deeply woven into the history of music than the tale of the deal with the devil. A struggling musician suddenly becomes impossibly talented. An unknown performer rises to legendary status almost overnight. A gifted artist achieves fame, fortune, and influence beyond imagination, only to suffer tragedy, obsession, madness, or an early death. And whenever this happens, people begin to whisper, how did they become so good? How did they become so successful? And what was the price? The answer, according to folklore, is simple. They sold their soul. The idea is ancient, far older than rock and roll, far older than the blues. In fact, the origins of the story stretch back hundreds of years into European folklore and Christian theology. The basic premise never changes. A person desires something desperately: power, knowledge, talent, wealth, love, and even immortality. Something they cannot obtain through ordinary means. Then comes an offer, a supernatural bargain. The devil grants their wish. In exchange, he receives their soul. The person enjoys years of glory and success, but eventually the debt must be paid, and the devil always comes to collect. For centuries, these stories circulated throughout Europe in different forms, but one particular tale would become the blueprint for almost every musical devil story that followed. The story of Faust. The real Faust may have existed. Historical records from the early 16th century mention a wandering German magician, astrologer, and alchemist named Johann Georg Faust. Accounts describe him as a scholar, a charlatan, a fortune teller, and perhaps a complete fraud. Whatever the truth may be, stories soon began spreading around Germany that this mysterious man had entered into a pact with Satan himself. According to legend, Faust became dissatisfied with the limits of human knowledge. He wanted more understanding, more power, more secrets. And so he made a deal with a demon known as Mephistopheles. For 24 years he would enjoy limitless knowledge and supernatural abilities. After those 24 years were over, his soul would belong to hell. The story exploded across Europe. By the late 16th century, it had become one of the most famous cautionary tales in the Western world. Writers adapted it. Poets expanded it. Playwrights transformed it. Generations grew up hearing different versions of the same terrifying message. Be careful what you wish for. Some dreams cost more than they're worth. What makes the Faust story so powerful is that it never really disappeared. It simply evolved. As society changed, the bargain changed too. The scholar seeking forbidden knowledge became the artist seeking genius. The magician seeking power became the musician seeking greatness. And nowhere was that transformation more dramatic than with a violinist who seemed almost supernatural to those who witnessed him perform. His name was Niccolò Paganini. If there was ever a musician who looked as though he might have walked straight out of a devil's story, it was Paganini. Born in Genoa in 1782, Paganini displayed extraordinary musical ability from a very young age, but child prodigies were not unheard of. The thing that made Paganini different was not merely his talent, it was the way he appeared and the way he played. Descriptions from people who saw him often sound less like eyewitness accounts and more like horror fiction. He was unnaturally thin. His face was gaunt. His skin appeared pale. His fingers seemed impossibly long. Some modern historians believe he may have suffered from a connective tissue disorder that gave him unusual flexibility, allowing him to execute techniques that other violinists simply could not replicate. But audiences in the early 19th century knew nothing about connective tissue disorders. All they knew was that they had never seen anything like him. When Paganini stepped onto a stage, he appeared almost ghost-like. Then he would begin to play. Witnesses described his performances with language bordering on hysteria. The violin screamed, it laughed, it cried, it sang. He performed passages so difficult that other musicians often believed they were impossible. People watched him in disbelief. Some claimed they could actually see demonic figures standing beside him while he played. Others swore they saw the devil guiding his bow. Rumours spread rapidly. Surely no ordinary man could possess such ability. There had to be an explanation, and the explanation many people settled on was simple. Paganini had sold his soul. The story became so widespread that it genuinely damaged his reputation in certain circles. Religious audiences viewed him with suspicion. Parents warned children about him. Priests condemned him. But every accusation only made him more famous. People travelled huge distances simply to witness the so-called devil's violinist. The rumours became part of the performance, part of the mythology, part of the attraction. Paganini himself never fully denied the stories. In fact, he occasionally seemed to enjoy them. Why wouldn't he? The rumours transformed him into something larger than life, a man surrounded by mystery, a man impossible to explain, a man who appeared to exist somewhere between genius and sorcery. One particularly famous legend claimed that Paganini had murdered a woman. Her soul, according to the story, had become trapped within his violin. This imprisoned spirit supposedly gave the instrument its supernatural voice. There was no evidence whatsoever for the tale, none at all. But people believed it, because extraordinary talent often makes people uncomfortable. When someone reaches a level that seems impossible, we instinctively search for an explanation. Hard work rarely satisfies us. Practice sounds too ordinary. Natural talent feels insufficient. We want something more dramatic, something supernatural, something dark. And so Paganini became one of the earliest musicians in modern history to acquire a reputation for having made a deal with the devil, a reputation that would survive long after his death. In 1840, Paganini died at the age of 57, yet even then the rumours refused to disappear. Because of lingering accusations regarding his supposed association with Satan, church authorities initially refused him a proper Catholic burial. Even in death, the devil stories followed him. And perhaps that's what makes the legend so fascinating. Paganini never claimed to possess supernatural powers. He never admitted to making any bargain. The evidence simply doesn't exist. Yet for more than 2 centuries, people have continued repeating the story. Not because it's true, but because it feels true. His talent seemed impossible, and whenever talent seems impossible, the devil inevitably enters the conversation. But Paganini was only the beginning, because as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the legend of the Faustian musician would cross oceans, change forms, and eventually find a new home in the American South. A lonely place where dirt roads met at the crossroads. A place where blues music was born. and where one young guitarist will become forever linked to perhaps the most famous deal with the devil in music history. By the early 20th century, the story of the Faustian bargain had travelled a very long way from the scholars and magicians of Europe. The devil was no longer offering forbidden knowledge in dusty medieval studies. Now he was supposedly offering something far more valuable: musical genius. And nowhere would that belief become stronger than in the American South. The deep South of the early 1900s was a world unlike anything most people today could imagine. It was a place of poverty and hardship, a place where folklore mixed freely with religion, where old African spiritual traditions blended with Christianity, where ghost stories, haints, root doctors, charms, curses, and supernatural beliefs were part of everyday life. People didn't necessarily separate the natural world from the supernatural one. The unseen was always close by. And within this world existed a special kind of location: the Crossroads. Across numerous cultures, crossroads have long been regarded as places of power, places where worlds overlap, places where choices are made, places where spirits can be encountered. In African American folklore, crossroads held a particularly important place. Some traditions suggested that if a musician went to a crossroads at midnight, a mysterious figure might appear. That stranger would take the instrument, tune it, play a few notes, and then hand it back. And from that moment onward, the musician would possess extraordinary ability. What's fascinating is that this story may not originally have involved the devil at all. Some folklorists believe the tale emerged from older West African spiritual traditions that survived the horrors of slavery and crossed the Atlantic. The figure encountered at the crossroads may once have been a spirit or deity rather than Satan. But as Christianity became increasingly intertwined with Southern culture, those older traditions gradually merged with Christian imagery. The mysterious spirit became the devil, and the crossroads became a place of temptation, a place of bargains, a place where destiny could be altered forever.
What time he coming round?
What time? Who coming round?
You don't be fooling with me. I'm talking about Legba.
Legba? Where you been at, Slick? He done changed his name to Scratch.
Long before Robert Johnson entered the story, there was another musician whose name deserves far more attention than it usually receives: Tommy Johnson. No relation, incidentally, just another Johnson. Born around 1896 in Mississippi, Tommy Johnson was one of the most influential blues musicians of his era. He was known for his haunting voice, his remarkable guitar playing, and his wild lifestyle. But more importantly for our story, he appears to have actively encouraged rumours that he had sold his soul. According to family members and people who knew him, Tommy openly told stories about meeting the devil at a crossroads. Unlike later musicians who spent their lives denying such claims, Tommy Johnson sometimes seemed perfectly happy to spread them. Whether he genuinely believed the story is another question entirely. He may simply have recognized something every entertainer understands: mystery sells. Legends attract attention, and people remember stories. A talented guitarist is impressive. A guitarist who learned his craft from the devil himself is unforgettable. The irony is that Tommy Johnson may actually be the original Crossroads musician, yet history would largely forget his role because another Johnson would soon eclipse him completely. a man whose story would become one of the most famous legends in all of music. That man is Robert Johnson. If Paganini was the first great devil musician, Robert Johnson became the definitive one. The legend is so famous today that many people assume it must contain at least a grain of truth. After all, how else could such a story survive for nearly a century? The reality, as always, is more complicated. Robert Johnson was born in Mississippi in 1911. Little is known about his life. The details are often fragmented. Memories conflict. Records are incomplete. In many ways, he remains an elusive figure. Part history, part folklore, part ghost. What does seem clear is that Robert initially wasn't considered an exceptional guitarist. In fact, according to several accounts from fellow musicians, he was viewed as fairly average. Sometimes worse than average. One story frequently repeated involves Robert attempting to play during breaks while established blues musicians performed. The older players supposedly found his efforts unimpressive. Some even laughed. If the stories are accurate, Robert was determined but not yet remarkable. Then something happened. Robert disappeared. Not for years, not forever, just long enough for people to notice. And when he returned, everything had changed. Suddenly, he was extraordinary. The same musicians who had mocked him now sat in disbelief. His technique had improved dramatically. His timing was impeccable. His phrasing was unique. His command of the instrument seemed almost supernatural. People struggled to explain the transformation. How could someone improve so much so quickly? And whenever people struggle to explain greatness, legends begin to grow. The story that emerged was simple. Robert Johnson had gone to a crossroads at midnight.
Been a long time, hasn't it, really?
There he met a large black man, or sometimes a dark figure, or sometimes the devil himself. The details vary depending on who's telling the tale. The stranger took Robert's guitar, tuned it, played it, and returned it. And from that moment onward, Robert Johnson possessed gifts beyond ordinary musicians. The bargain had been made, the price would eventually be collected. It's one of the greatest stories in American folklore.
According to this here piece of paper, the deal's still on.
The problem is that there is virtually no evidence Robert Johnson ever told it himself. Most versions of the legend appeared years later, often second-hand. The story evolved over time, growing larger with every retelling. Yet despite this lack of evidence, the myth became inseparable from Robert Johnson for another reason: his songs. Unlike many blues musicians, Robert frequently used imagery involving the devil, hell, demons, and supernatural forces. Songs such as Me and the Devil Blues and Hellhound on My Trail seem to provide confirmation. Surely he was confessing. Surely he was revealing the truth. But when examined more carefully, the picture becomes less straightforward. Blues music often employed vivid religious and supernatural imagery. Biblical references were everywhere. Metaphors involving judgment, sin, and damnation were common. The devil appeared in songs for the same reason he appeared in sermons. He was part of the cultural language of the time. Yet there remains something undeniably eerie about Robert Johnson. Listen carefully to his recordings. Even today, they possess a strange quality. They feel distant, almost haunted, as though they have travelled through time. Partly, this is because only 29 songs survive from his recording sessions. 29 songs. That's all. An entire legend built upon a remarkably small body of work. But what extraordinary work it was. Those recordings will go on to influence generations. Blues musicians studied them obsessively. Rock musicians treated them almost like sacred texts. Decades later, young guitarists in Britain would discover Robert Johnson's recordings and find themselves utterly mesmerised. Among them were future members of some of the biggest rock bands in history. Without Robert Johnson, there is a very good chance that there would be no Led Zeppelin, no Cream, no Rolling Stones as we know them. His influence reached everywhere. And perhaps that influence contributed to the myth, because Robert Johnson's life ended almost as mysteriously as it had unfolded. In 1938, at just 27 years old, he was dead. The circumstances remain uncertain. The most widely accepted explanation is poisoning. According to one account, a jealous husband slipped poison into Robert's drink after discovering his wife had been seeing the musician, but certainty remains elusive. There was no official investigation capable of resolving every question, no definitive answer, only rumours. And rumours thrive in the absence of facts. A brilliant musician, a meteoric rise, songs about devils and hellhounds, a mysterious death at 27. It was almost too perfect. The ingredients of myth were all there. The devil had supposedly granted Robert greatness.
I didn't end up where I wanted. I didn't end up with nothing. Didn't get nothing.
You got what you were supposed to get, blues man. Ain't nothing ever as good as we want it to be. But that ain't no reason to break a deal.
Now the devil had returned to claim what was owed. At least, that's how the story was told. And over the decades that followed, the legend only grew larger. Books repeated it. Films referenced it.
Oh, I can get us there real quick.
Documentaries explored it. Countless musicians spoke about it. The Crossroads became one of the most famous locations in musical folklore. Tourists traveled to Mississippi searching for it. Photographs were taken. Markers were erected. Arguments broke out over which crossroads was the real crossroads, because nobody actually knows. There are several candidates, several locations, several competing theories. The truth is almost certainly lost. Yet in a strange way, that uncertainty is exactly why the legend survives. A mystery with a clear answer eventually ends. A mystery without one can live forever. And Robert Johnson's story would become the foundation upon which countless future legends were built. Because long before a new generation of musicians would emerge, a generation armed not with acoustic guitars, but with amplifiers, electric guitars, distortion, volume. A generation that would take the old blues myths and transform them into something darker, something louder, something called rock and roll. And once again, people would begin whispering about the devil. By the time the 1960s arrived, the legend of Robert Johnson had begun a second life. For years, his records had been obscure, treasured by collectors perhaps, but largely unknown to the wider world. Then something remarkable happened. A generation of young British musicians discovered the blues. Not through history books, not through universities, but through old records. Scratched records, imported records, records passed around between obsessed young guitarists who spent every spare penny hunting for sounds that seemed to come from another world. And among those sounds was Robert Johnson. To these young musicians, Johnson wasn't simply a bluesman. He was a mystery, a ghost from another era, a man whose music seemed impossibly modern despite being recorded decades earlier. His influence spread quietly at first, then everywhere. The young musicians who absorbed his music would go on to form bands that changed the course of popular music forever. The Rolling Stones, Cream, Fleetwood Mac, Led Zeppelin. Eric Clapton once described Johnson as the most important blues singer that had ever lived. Keith Richards famously wondered how one man could create such a huge sound on his own. The legend was growing again, only now it was no longer confined to Mississippi. The Crossroads had crossed the Atlantic, and when it arrived in Britain, it found fertile ground, because Britain already had its own fascination with the occult. Ghost stories, ancient pagan traditions, witchcraft folklore, mysterious stone circles, secret societies. It was a landscape perfectly suited for old legends to take root once again. And among all the musicians of that era, none would become more closely associated with occult mythology than one man. His name was Jimmy Page. To understand why Page became such a magnet for these stories, you first have to understand something about him. Unlike many celebrities who spent their careers avoiding strange subjects, Page actively explored them. He wasn't merely interested in the occult, he was fascinated by it. Books, symbolism, mysticism, ceremonial magic, esoteric traditions. These weren't passing interests. They became lifelong passions. Page's fascination eventually led him towards one of the most controversial occult figures in modern history, a man named Aleister Crowley. Even today, Crowley's reputation remains extraordinary. Depending on who you ask, he was a philosopher, a mystic, a magician, a genius, a fraud, a revolutionary thinker, or one of the wickedest men who ever lived. Often all at the same time. Born in 1875, Crowley became notorious throughout Britain. Newspapers sensationalized his activities. Religious groups condemned him. His experiments with magic and occult practices created a reputation that followed him for the rest of his life. Crowley adopted the phrase, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," a statement that horrified some people and fascinated others. By the 1960s, Crowley had become a countercultural icon, a figure surrounded by mystery, and Jimmy Page was captivated. Page collected Crowley's writings, studied his ideas. Eventually, he even purchased Backmasking House, Crowley's former residence on the shores of Loch Ness in Scotland. To Page, this was intellectual curiosity, a genuine fascination with esoteric subjects. To many outsiders, however, it looked very different. Because here's the thing, when one of the world's greatest guitarists becomes deeply interested in occult symbolism, people begin connecting dots. The timing only fueled the rumours. Led Zeppelin's rise was extraordinary. Their success was immense. Their influence was unprecedented. Within a remarkably short period of time, they became one of the biggest bands on earth. And just as people had once looked at Paganini and wondered whether a normal human being could possess such talent, some began looking at Led Zeppelin in much the same way, especially Jimmy Page. The whispers started quietly. They grew louder. Had Page made some kind of bargain? Was his obsession with Crowley merely academic? Or was there something darker behind it all? The stories multiplied. Every tragedy associated with the band became fuel for speculation. The death of Robert Plant's young son, the serious car accidents, the death of drummer John Bonham, even unrelated events became woven into increasingly elaborate theories. Soon, people were speaking about curses, dark forces, occult debts. The old Faustian template was emerging once again. Extraordinary success, followed by misfortune, followed by whispers of a hidden price. Of course, there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that Jimmy Page ever believed he had sold his soul, or made any supernatural bargain, for that matter. Yet the rumours endured because they followed a pattern humanity has repeated for centuries. We struggle to accept greatness as ordinary. We want explanations. And when talent reaches a certain level, ordinary explanations begin to feel unsatisfying. Then came Black Sabbath. And suddenly, the devil was no longer hiding in the shadows. He was standing centre stage. When Black Sabbath emerged in 1970, they sounded unlike anything audience had heard before. Dark, heavy, foreboding. Their music felt dangerous, almost threatening, at least by the standards of the time. Songs referenced evil, nightmares, occult imagery, supernatural terror. Parents panicked. Religious groups protested. Newspapers sensationalized everything. Ozzy Osbourne and the band quickly found themselves accused of promoting Satanism. The reality was almost the opposite. Many of Black Sabbath's songs were actually warnings about evil rather than celebrations of it. But once public fear takes hold, facts often become secondary. The image had already formed, and for millions of people around the world, Black Sabbath became proof that dark forces had entered rock music. The irony is that musicians often understood exactly what was happening. Fear sells. Mystery sells. Danger sells. The same principle that helped create the Paganini legend centuries earlier was still operating. Only now it was amplified through television, radio, and mass media. The devil had become good marketing. Then came another strange coincidence, one that would strengthen the Faustian myth further. The 27 Club. The idea itself didn't truly crystallize until much later, but the pattern was impossible to ignore. Robert Johnson, dead at 27. Then decades later, Brian Jones, 27. Jimi Hendrix, dead at 27. Janis Joplin, dead at 27. Jim Morrison, 27. And an honorary mention to Kurt Cobain in later years, dead at 27. Suddenly, a narrative began to emerge. Perhaps success came with a hidden cost. Perhaps fame itself was dangerous. Perhaps greatness required sacrifice. The deaths had entirely rational explanations. Yet rational explanations rarely compete successfully against mythology, especially when the mythology is compelling. And few myths are more compelling than the idea that success demands a price. It's an ancient story, the same story told through Faust, the same story told through Paganini, the same story told through Robert Johnson, and now it was being told through rock stars. And as rock music grew larger throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the legends would become even stranger. because the next phase of the Faustian bargain story wouldn't revolve around Crossroads or bluesmen or occult scholars. It would revolve around hidden messages. Satanic Panic, Backmasking, heavy metal, and a growing belief among millions that the devil himself had infiltrated popular music. The Crossroads had evolved once again. By the late 1970s, the old Faustian bargain story had undergone yet another transformation. For centuries, people had feared that musicians were meeting the devil face to face. Now they feared something altogether different, that the devil was speaking directly through the music itself. To understand how bizarre things became, you have to remember the atmosphere of the time. The world was changing rapidly. Traditional institutions were losing influence. Youth culture was becoming more rebellious. Rock stars were no longer entertainers. They were icons. Some were treated almost like prophets, others like villains. And whenever a society experiences rapid change, fear tends to fill the gaps. People begin looking for explanations, for scapegoats, for hidden causes. Music became one of them. Suddenly, parents, religious groups, television preachers, and campaigners began asking a question. What exactly are young people listening to? And more importantly, what messages are they receiving? The answer, according to some, was astonishing. Rock music wasn't merely rebellious, it was satanic. The accusations exploded during what would later become known as the Satanic Panic, a period stretching roughly from the late 70s through much of the 80s. It is difficult today to fully appreciate just how widespread these fears actually became. People genuinely believed secret satanic conspiracies were operating throughout society. Television programs discussed them. Newspapers reported on them. Books were written about them. Police departments investigated them. And musicians found themselves directly in the crosshairs. One of the strangest accusations involved something called backmasking. The theory claimed that musicians were hiding satanic messages inside their records, not in the normal lyrics, but backwards. According to believers, if certain songs were played in reverse, hidden messages would reveal themselves. Messages supposedly encouraging devil worship, drug use, violence, and corruption. The most famous target was Led Zeppelin, particularly their song Stairway to Heaven. For years, people insisted that hidden satanic phrases could be heard when sections of the song were reversed. Millions listened. Millions argued. Millions convinced themselves they could hear messages. Psychologists today would call this pareidolia, the tendency for the human brain to find patterns even when none actually exist. The same reason people see faces in clouds. But at the same time, many people were absolutely convinced the devil had infiltrated rock music, and Led Zeppelin once again found themselves linked to occult mythology. The irony, of course, is that no actual evidence ever emerged, but evidence was becoming less important than belief, and belief was powerful, especially when combined with fear. Then there was Ozzy Osbourne. If someone had deliberately designed a rock star to terrify conservative parents, they could have hardly done a better job. Long hair, dark imagery, heavy music, stories of excess. controversies seemingly appearing wherever he went. Yet Ozzy's reputation often bore little resemblance to reality. One infamous incident involved the bat. The story has become legendary. During a performance in Iowa in 1982, a fan threw what Ozzy believed was a rubber bat onto the stage. Assuming it was a fake, he picked it up and bit its head off. Unfortunately, it wasn't fake. The incident became international news. And from that moment onward, Ozzy's reputation as some kind of Prince of Darkness became cemented forever. The reality was considerably less dramatic. It was a mistake. A bizarre and unfortunate mistake. But reality rarely stands a chance against mythology. The story spread worldwide. The legend grew larger. And once again, people connected the dots. Dark imagery. Controversial performances. Huge success. Surely there must be something sinister behind it all, right? Ozzy spent years insisting otherwise. And the accusations never fully disappeared. Because by now, the Faustian bargain had become less about actual evidence and more about symbolism. People no longer needed proof. They simply needed a story. And nowhere was this more obvious than in the case of Ronnie James Dio. Dio is remembered as one of the greatest voices in the history of heavy metal, but he is also remembered for something else: the hand gesture. The famous horns. Today, it is almost synonymous with heavy metal culture. Millions of fans throw the gesture at concerts without thinking twice about it. But when Dio popularized it, some immediately interpreted it as a satanic symbol. The truth was considerably more mundane. Dio explained repeatedly that his Italian grandmother used the gesture to ward off the evil eye. It was a protective symbol, not an invitation to darkness. Yet rumors persisted, because rumors always persist. The symbol was too perfect, too visually striking, too easily misunderstood, and so another innocent piece of folklore became absorbed into the mythology. By now, an interesting pattern was becoming clear. Most musicians accused of making deals with the devil had never actually claimed to do so. The stories were usually imposed upon them by others. Society projected the myth onto them, the same way audiences projected it onto Paganini, the same way listeners projected it onto Robert Johnson, the same way conspiracy theorists projected it onto Led Zeppelin. The myth wasn't really about musicians. It was about us, about our need to explain extraordinary things, our need to find causes, our need to believe greatness must come from somewhere beyond the ordinary. Yet there were some artists who deliberately embraced the imagery, perhaps none more than King Diamond. With corpse-like face paint, theatrical performances, and openly occult themes, King Diamond became one of heavy metal's most controversial figures. His music explored dark subjects, ghost stories, hauntings, supernatural narratives, religious symbolism. Predictably, accusations followed. Yet when examined closely, much of his work resembled horror films more than religious doctrine. Storytelling, performance, theatrical entertainment, the distinction often disappeared in the eyes of critics. And perhaps that was inevitable, because fear has a habit of simplifying things. Nuance vanishes, complexity disappears, only the headlines remain. Then came the 1990s, and with them arrived a new cultural villain, a new target for public anxiety, a new musician accused of corrupting society, Marilyn Manson. If Ozzy frightened parents, Manson terrified them. Everything about his image seemed designed to provoke. Religion, politics, sexuality, authority. Nothing was off limits. Predictably, accusations of Satanism followed almost immediately. Some people blamed him for everything they feared about modern culture. In the aftermath of tragedies such as Columbine, rumours spread at extraordinary speed. Many of those rumours turned out to be false. Some were completely fabricated. Yet they circulated regardless. Because once someone becomes a symbol, facts become secondary. The symbol takes on a life of its own. And by this point, the old Faustian bargain had evolved yet again. No longer was it simply about talent or musical ability. Now it was about fame itself. People began speaking about celebrities selling their souls, not for guitar skills, but for success, for wealth, for influence, for stardom. The phrase entered popular culture. You sold your soul. People said it casually. Politicians were accused of it. Actors were accused of it. Business leaders were even accused of it. Musicians were accused of it. The literal devil was slowly disappearing from the story. What remained was the metaphor. The idea that achieving greatness requires sacrifice. That reaching the top demands compromise. That every dream comes with a cost. In some ways, this interpretation may be far older than any supernatural explanation, because when you look closely at the lives of history's greatest musicians, a pattern emerges. Not a supernatural pattern, a human one. Obsession, isolation, relentless practice, broken relationships, physical exhaustion, mental strain, years spent pursuing perfection while ordinary life slips away. Perhaps that is the real bargain. Perhaps the Crossroads was never a physical location at all. Perhaps it was always a choice, a decision made by artists throughout history to dedicate themselves completely to their craft, whatever the consequences, whatever the cost. But before we draw conclusions, there remains one final journey to make, because the Faustian bargain story is still alive today. It has simply adapted to the internet age. The Crossroads now exists online. The rumours spread faster than ever before, and the old question continues to echo through modern culture: what are people willing to sacrifice for greatness? And does anyone ever truly reach the top without paying a price? So here we are, after hundreds of years, after countless rumours, after Paganini, after Robert Johnson, after Led Zeppelin, after heavy metal, satanic panic, conspiracy theories, and internet folklore. We're left with a question. Did any of it actually happen? Did anybody truly sell their soul? Did a young bluesman really stand at a Mississippi crossroads at midnight and shake hands with the devil? Did Paganini obtain his impossible talent through dark forces? And did Jimmy Page uncover forbidden knowledge hidden within occult texts? Or are these stories simply that? Stories. The truth, frustratingly perhaps, is that history rarely gives us definitive answers. What it does give us are clues, patterns, human behaviour, and when we look carefully, something interesting begins to emerge. The Faustian bargain survives because it speaks to something deeply human, not necessarily our belief in the devil, but our relationship with ambition. Think about it. Every great artist sacrifices something. Every one of them. Perhaps not their soul, but something. Time, relationships, security, comfort, normality. Many spend years isolated from friends and family. Many endure poverty before success arrives. Many become obsessed. Some destroy themselves chasing perfection. Others achieve greatness only to discover that greatness itself comes with consequences. In that sense, the old Faust story remains surprisingly modern because it isn't really about demons, it's about desire. The desire to become more than we are. The desire to transcend ordinary limits. The desire to be remembered. And that desire can be dangerous. Not because the devil appears, not because obsession does. The musician spends 10 hours practicing while everyone else goes home. The songwriter sacrifices sleep. The performer sacrifices privacy. The artist sacrifices certainty. Every crossroads involves a decision, and every decision has a cost. Perhaps that is why Robert Johnson's story continues to resonate. Whether the crossroads encounter happened or not almost becomes irrelevant. The story feels true. Not historically, emotionally. Because every musician understands the crossroads. Every artist eventually reaches a point where they must choose. How much am I willing to give? How much of my life will I devote to this thing? What am I prepared to sacrifice? The crossroads becomes a metaphor. And perhaps it always was. Yet at the same time, it would be foolish to dismiss the power of folklore entirely. Legends exist for a reason. They survive because they fulfill a need. People have always struggled to explain genius. When someone appears capable of doing something extraordinary, a first instinct is to often search for extraordinary explanations. Hard work feels too simple. Practice feels too ordinary. Natural talent feels insufficient. Surely there must be something else. Something hidden. Something secret. This is precisely what's happened with Paganini. Audiences looked at him and saw something impossible. So they created a story. The devil became the explanation. The same thing happened with Robert Johnson. A musician improves dramatically. The improvement seems unbelievable. The devil becomes the explanation. Jimmy Page becomes one of the most influential guitarists in history. The devil becomes the explanation. Again and again. Century after century. Different musicians, same story. Perhaps what these legends reveal isn't anything about the musicians themselves. Perhaps they reveal something about us. Our fascination with greatness. Our discomfort with excellence. Our tendency to mythologize those we admire. After all, it can be difficult to accept that the greatest artists are often just people like you and me. Remarkable people, perhaps, gifted people, obsessive people even, but people nonetheless. The myth is more satisfying than the reality. A deal with the devil is a better story than 30 years of relentless dedication. A crossroads encounter is more exciting than thousands of hours of practice. The supernatural explanation feels richer, more cinematic, more memorable. And maybe that's exactly why these stories refuse to die. Because they belong to the same tradition as ghost stories around campfires. Ancient myths told beneath starlight. Folk tales passed from generation to generation. They satisfy a part of us that facts alone cannot reach. Yet there remains one final mystery, because despite all the rational explanations, despite all the skepticism, the Crossroads still attracts visitors. People still travel there. People still take photographs. People still stand in the Mississippi night imagining what might have happened. And perhaps that's fitting, because the Crossroads was never really about geography. It was never about two roads intersecting in the dark. The real Crossroads exists inside every creative person, every musician, every writer, every artist. It's the moment where passion collides with sacrifice, where dreams collide with reality, where ambition demands a price. And that's where the Faustian bargain truly lives. Not in hell, not in folklore, not in the shadows, but in the choices people make. Decisions that shape entire lives. As for whether anybody genuinely sold their soul, history remains silent. The evidence simply isn't there. But the stories endure. And perhaps they always will. Because somewhere tonight, a young guitarist is sitting alone in a bedroom. A young songwriter is chasing a melody that won't quite arrive. A young musician is dreaming of greatness. And somewhere in the back of their mind lingers the oldest musical legend of them all, the whisper that there might be a shortcut, a secret, a bargain, a way to become extraordinary. Most will eventually discover the truth. There are no shortcuts, no magical contracts, no supernatural gifts, only work, only dedication, only sacrifice. But maybe that's the strangest part of the whole story, because when you look at what the greatest musicians gave up to achieve their dreams, the old legends don't seem quite so ridiculous after all. Perhaps nobody ever sold their soul. Perhaps they simply gave so much of themselves to their art that from the outside it looked exactly the same. And maybe, just maybe, that's why the devil always gets the credit.